What was it like to live in Britain before a modern sewage system was created? The stench must have been so overpowering that people must have felt pretty nauseous a lot of the time. I suppose the counter-argument to that was that it was so relentless, so constant, that it became kind of normalised. That people almost shrugged their shoulders saying, well, what do you expect? That brings me to the existence of Boris Johnson, our very own modern day open sewer. Now, he stopped being Prime Minister nearly a year ago, and I'd say, woohoo, got rid of him. Except we're still stuck with his deranged political party, which in lots of, I'd say, fundamental ways has become even more unhinged since he was forced out of office. So it was wise to keep the champagne on ice. But nonetheless, he still finds ways, I would say creative, ingenious ways, to repulse and disgust. Which brings me on to the Mail column he wrote. He is, of course, employed by the Mail, one of the many ways he's cashing it in. But he wrote about the Lionesses in advance of the World Cup. Now, how is it possible for a prominent politician to write a column about the Lionesses that disgusts? Because it's pretty easy to just write something full of platitudes. Woohoo, go Lionesses, inspiring, encouraging women's sports, something for us all to cheer on. Maybe, I'd say, some good political conclusions about how we could better resource and support women's sports, take on stigma, that kind of thing. Now, here's what Boris Johnson wrote. The headline is, I'd strap the Taliban into their chairs on Sunday and make them watch our Lionesses until they understand the skill, strength and talent that women possess. Now, in it, he is full of self-congratulation, and that really is what has made me feel quite violently sick. You see, he writes, for example, I'm proud of the way we helped thousands upon thousands of Afghans to leave at great speed and find sanctuary in this country. Now, before I take on this really quite nauseating self-congratulation, he uses this supposed column about the Lionesses to make a partisan attack on the left. He says, but you will never succeed if your society is governed by bigoted and chauvinistic men who actually believe that a girl who can read, let alone a girl who understands the offside rule of football, is somehow an offence against the word of God. Plenty of people, mainly on the left, will suggest that this approach is wrong and culturally imperialist. They will claim we should not be judgmental about people's traditions. We will not get a hearing from the Taliban, they say, if we persist in calling them medieval. Who thinks this on the left? Sorry, where did this little straw man come from? You see, if you're on the left, then you are a universalist. You believe that human rights, such as the fundamental and inherent equality of women, is just a basic principle. The same with LGBTQ rights, for example. And the reason actually this I find so nauseating is because under Boris Johnson, as other governments, the British state was allied to, e.g., Saudi Arabia, one of our main allies, in fact, in the Middle East and globally. That is a regime which brutalises women, that removes their basic human rights, and that is defended, Saudi Arabia, as being, well, it's another country with their own customs and values. Who are we to impose what we think on Saudi Arabia? So we'll just keep giving them weapons to destroy Yemen and murder its children, and overlook the way it beheads gay people, removes any vestige of democracy and human rights because it's another culture. We're not the ones arguing that. We're the ones arguing against those violations of human rights, regardless of what other country Saudi Arabia happens to be. So you can stick that one up your pipe. Now, here's what I actually find so fundamentally nauseating about self-congratulation. Now, we remember almost exactly 2 years ago when scores of Afghans were desperately overwhelming Kabul airport as they attempted to flee the onward march of the Taliban as the capital of Afghanistan fell. Now, I'm an animal lover. I love cats, my cats, very much, in fact, as anyone who follows me on Instagram can testify. But I do believe that human life is sacred above all other life. So the fact that cats and dogs from the Nowzad animal shelter were evacuated, taking up space which could have gone to human beings, is absolutely scandalous. Now, Downing Street have claimed repeatedly that this had nothing to do with Boris Johnson and indeed his office. So let's just put that on record. He denies what I'm about to say. But what was revealed in January 2022 were emails between British officials released, it must be said, by the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, which suggests that when the Taliban were marching through Kabul, it was Boris Johnson who decided to evacuate the staff of Farthing with the sanctuary and its animals. So one email from an official said, Nowzad had received a lot of publicity, and the PM has just authorised their staff and animals to be evacuated. Another email shows officials referring to the PM's decision to evacuate the staff of the Nowzad Animal Charity. Having regard to the Prime Minister's Nowzad decision, the Foreign Secretary might consider the vets and the dependents should be included. They might be able to get to the airport with the dependents in time. Now, we're expected to believe Boris Johnson's word that he wouldn't be dishonest, as if he'd do such a thing. That paragon of honesty, integrity and decency. So let's just scan forward to March 2022, when you got then another whistleblower who said it was widespread knowledge in government that Boris Johnson ordered, this is in The Guardian, the prioritisation of an animal charity based in Afghanistan for evacuation during the Taliban takeover last summer. So this was Josie Stewart. She worked in the Foreign Office for 7 years, including at Kabul Airport. And she told the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that direction for the Prime Minister was evidenced in multiple messages on Teams, on emails and in conversations around the crisis centre, which was set up to try to help tens of thousands of desperate Afghans who were trying to flee. Now, this guy is congratulating himself on saving civilians from Afghanistan when there is allegations here, strong repeated allegations by multiple people, that he prioritised at one point cats and dogs. He gave space to cats and dogs rather than human beings. It doesn't end there. His self-congratulation over supporting Afghan refugees. This month, a report by the Refugee Council found that the promise of the government's Operation Warm Welcome to help people fleeing Afghanistan has not yet been met, and Afghan refugees are slowly being abandoned. They found that thousands of men, women and children were trapped in limbo with nowhere permanent to live, many of them stuck in Afghanistan itself or in neighbouring Pakistan, unable to reach Britain's shores. The Refugee Council stated at the end of March 2023 there were almost 9,000 Afghan men, women and children who'd been evacuated from Afghanistan still being accommodated in temporary hotel accommodation. These people face being evicted from hotels by the end of August. With no policy in place for what will happen at this point, Afghan families are facing the risk of being street homeless after being evicted. Astonishing. The promises made by the British state, and I have to say, given the role of the West, I haven't even mentioned, in the rise of the Taliban, because you see what happened in the 1980s when the Mujahideen were seen as heroes fighting the Soviet occupation, is the West funneled support to the Mujahideen, which often went to the most extreme elements, because it was either funneled through Pakistan's secret services, who ended up giving it to the most extreme Mujahideen elements, or indeed the role of the aforementioned Saudi Arabia, who helped, again, bolster and support the most extreme elements. All of that helped pave the way for the Taliban. And then we have this war, which Britain was involved with for 2 decades, our own armed soldiers, where there are very strong evidence of human rights violations which were committed, which enabled the Taliban to win an element of popular support. I should say, I think the vast majority of Afghanistan opposes them, but it undermined support for the resistance or any fight against the Taliban because of the human rights abuses associated with Western troops. We fought in that country and then we betrayed that country. And Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister of the country, when the Taliban returned, he has to bear responsibility for part of what happened. And that's why we have to talk about what Boris Johnson failed to do when it comes to refugees in Afghanistan, but also the allegations that pets were prioritised over human life. This guy using the lionesses to try and bolster his reputation on Afghanistan and launch bizarre, I would say unhinged attacks on the left about supposedly regarding the brutal, horrendous attacks on human rights, specifically women's rights, not just women's rights, LGBTQ rights, for example, as well, that we on the left regard that as just part of someone else's culture, which we're not supposed to stick our noses into, when this government, the British government, the Conservative government, which it did under Boris Johnson, supports the likes of Saudi Arabia and their brutal oppression of women and LGBTQ people and any dissent. It's stomach churning. The guy is nauseating. He's absolutely nauseating. Beyond shame. And it does need to be pointed out, because we do need to point out what's happened to Afghan refugees who've been betrayed, and we do need to point out the hypocrisy and double standards of prominent British politicians when it comes to human rights. Anyway, I said my piece. Love to hear your thoughts. Do share them. Do press like and subscribe. Do keep this channel and podcast on the road by supporting us at patreon.com/ownjazz84 and listen to us on the podcast. I will speak to you soon.